Hello and welcome to another episode of A Mic on the Podium. This time we meet a conductor who was born and raised in New Zealand and now lives and works in Scotland. She conducts in the concert hall as well as opera and ballet, and she is soon to become music director of Symphony Nova Scotia. It's a great pleasure to welcome Holly Mathieson. So Holly, good afternoon, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
As with everybody else, I'm going to start right at the very beginning. Can you tell us about your earliest days of music?
Absolutely. For me, as with the vast majority of professional musicians, it came through family. My grandmother was a pianist, my maternal grandmother, and she lived in a tiny little country town in New Zealand, but ended up getting the highest mark in LTCL in the Commonwealth or something like that in the 1930s at some point. Anyway, she was amazing and was offered a place at, I think, Trinity as a teenager to move to London to do that, which was enormous for someone living in a tiny country town in New Zealand. But she found herself in the family way, as they used to say back then, and had to marry, as happened with a lot of women in that generation, I think. But she continued teaching. She taught all of her children to some degree and most of the grandchildren. And I was the youngest grandchild to be living in close proximity. So I was sort of the last hope. And it also coincided, this was a perfect storm. My immediate family, my parents and my two sisters and I, we were in a really dreadful car accident, and when I was 2. So I ended up living with my grandma for quite a bit of my childhood up until about the age of 10. And so even more so, I was right there. I was the last possible grandchild within reach to try and turn into a musician. And it became actually a really lovely bond between us. It's difficult studying with a family member, I have to say.
Yeah, that's true. I taught my daughter the violin very briefly, and yeah, it's very difficult to teach or be taught by somebody in your family.
Yes, and especially with grandma, there was that slight level of desperation about of desperately wanting me to succeed and knowing I was the last chance, and also grieving her daughter, my mother, who by this point was dying or had died. So there was all sorts of baggage around piano with grandma, but at the same time, it was really a huge therapeutic thing. And I remember when I stayed with her, I'd sleep on the sun porch, which was a tiny little room at the front of the house. And the music room was through the wall, and she would play every night as I was falling asleep. That was her main time for playing. And so I would go to sleep every night with the sound of Metner and Poulenc and Rachmaninoff and all of the stuff she loved.
Wow, that's quite a story.
Yeah, it's cool. And so that was the earliest music. And the other big part of that part of my life was I did ballet very, very seriously. So all of the ballet repertoire and using music as a physically expressive sort of thing was a big thing early on. But then once I got to sort of high school age, I should add I was a really rubbish pianist. I never practiced. I was so lazy, but I was good at faking sight reading, if you know what I mean. I could sit down and play anything I'd heard. I was probably playing at the wrong key, but I knew how it went, and I could fake things very well. So I ended up being a school pianist and things like that. And when I was about 14, I was sort of unofficially adopted by another mum in another family. And she went to a really lovely Presbyterian church in town. So I went and sang in the choir there for about 5 years, which was great. It was really wonderful training, as anyone who's sung the cathedral or church choir will know.
So it sounds like you maybe had a choice at some point between thinking about being a ballet dancer or maybe taking your music further on into your life. Is that true?
Absolutely. And the first choice was always ballet. 100%. And actually, I went and studied full time at the New Zealand School of Dance, but I got very sick with glandular fever, and I had a very bad injury in my left shin that wasn't clearing up. So I went back home to Dunedin, which was my hometown, and I had the option of going back to high school to finish off. And I remember going in for one day and seeing people getting told off for not having their socks pulled up. I thought, God, I've had a taste of freedom. There's no way I can go back to this. But I'd been studying composition with the local composition professor at the university since I was about 14, just informally. So he said, well, why don't you just come and start your music degree a year early?
And where was that? Was that still in New Zealand?
Yes, the University of Otago, which is in my hometown, right down the bottom of New Zealand. A very strong Scottish diaspora. It's basically the map of Edinburgh slapped on a bit of Pacific Island. So I was studying there. Composition was my major, but I did conducting with the same teacher, Jack Spears, who's a Yorkshireman actually. He was from Harrogate and moved, one of various British teachers who moved out and got university positions out there, sort of in the 60s and 70s, I suppose. And he was great. He was a phenomenal conducting teacher and composition, but conducting pretty rapidly took over for me. Yeah, it was a really nice place to study. It was the sort of city that once people knew you were interested in doing something like conducting, they would throw some opportunities at you. You'd get a call from a church choir that needed someone for maternity leave for 6 months, or little amateur orchestras who needed someone to take a rehearsal. And eventually, the local opera company and the local orchestra and things would, they gave me work there's no way I deserved to do. I had no idea what it was like. And that was facilitated partly by that teacher, Jack Spears, but also Tequin Evans, who was a good 8 or 9 years ahead of me in the scheme of things, but had, funnily enough, been my high school choir conductor. And that's the first conducting I ever did, actually. He had to go to hospital one time. So he since I was a school pianist, unofficially, he got me to take the rehearsals.
Interesting, looking ahead, that at that stage you had Jack Spears and Tequin Evans teaching you conducting, but just a very, very short list of the people that I know that you had some lessons with on various courses: Mark Stringer, Neil Thompson, John Carew, Naomi Yervi, Paavo Yervi. I'm assuming they all had very, very different styles.
Totally. Absolutely. And I've been fairly lucky, actually. I sort of had this idea with masterclasses and things, and even doing a full course with someone. Each conducting teacher, there's a time in your career where when you're learning, where what they have to teach will be useful to you. I don't think you have one teacher all the way through that gives you everything you need, or at least if there is such a person, I've not met them. But rather, it's a little bit a matter of luck or research to work out, right, that teacher is awesome for this tool, for the toolkit, and this is the time I'm ready to learn that skill or that element of it, or take that on. So there might be a teacher that works absolutely brilliantly for yourself at a masterclass, but someone else in the room either is past needing that level or isn't ready to take in what they're going to teach or something. I could be wrong about that. I don't know. Disagree with me if you like.
No, I think it's much the same with instrumental teaching, in the fact that if you take on every single word that your teacher says to you, you become a carbon copy of that. I mean, for instance, my violin teacher was a good foot smaller than me. She had tiny hands and I have massive, great big shovels. And so, I couldn't take on absolutely everything that she told me because it just didn't work for my body shape, let alone musical stuff. And I think it's the same with conducting. We all use our bodies in different ways, but there are some basics that you can grab and take from a teacher. and as you say, you take something from one person, something else from another, then you put it all together in your own jigsaw puzzle in your mind, and hopefully form a good way of going forwards, don't you think?
Yeah, and sometimes something just sits in the back of your mind percolating for a couple of years, and it's not until after you've had contact with another teacher or mentor or colleague that it sinks into place what they meant by it 2 years ago. So it sort of sits on a shelf waiting to be understood or something.
Yeah. I mean, from that list I said earlier on of those amazing names, any of those stand out to you as giving you advice that you would still think about to the present day?
Absolutely. Paavo Järvi was an amazing teacher. It really surprised me. I didn't associate him with teaching. He's in the full throes of his own career, but he was an absolutely brilliant teacher. And part of it was that because he teaches just, I think, the one course a year at essentially the Järvi Family Reunion Festival in Estonia, he's not distracted with anything else. So he really just devotes all his time to what he's doing there without distraction. And you all go to the pub afterwards and get quite trolleyed. So it's a very social thing as well. And you all become friends for the 2 weeks. But what was particularly interesting to me, well, I remember him giving up his own lunch break along with the principal cellist to spend time with me talking about the breath in the auftakt. We just spent a good 40 minutes just trying to connect the breath to the physical gesture and help me try and feel that one little thing. So he was very generous, very specific in his teaching. But I remember from that course marveling at how good he was at teaching women, because, and I do not mean this in a derogatory way at all, but he loves women, and he's not shy at all about looking at women's bodies or talking about women's bodies. So there was this really wonderful sense of, no, he's genuinely thinking about what it's like as a player to watch gendered bodies in either direction, and speaking very openly about what his response is and how it feels. And so we got into these great discussions about sort of these deeply ingrained cultural things around feminine and masculine gestures. And we were talking about the fact that some of us in the class, there's one woman in particular, really musical, really good, but whenever she wanted something, she'd sort of cock her head slightly to the side. And so he just got her to do it again and again and again in front of him until he said, "I've got it. You look like you're my mum telling me off. That's why I don't want to play it." And if you're a man doing that gesture, it would have a different meaning. I'd never had a teacher admit, yeah, there is a difference with the way we receive women's bodies and men's bodies and everything else, and teach it in a really positive way. It was really cool. Sasha Polichuk in St. Petersburg was a tremendous teacher for me. Everything connected to harmony, which I loved. I'd gotten that from Jack Spears. Our conducting lessons were just harmony lessons, basically. And the same with John Carew. He doesn't do anything physical. It's really just talking about harmony. So I loved that about Sasha, but also he had that very Russian thing of talking about tiny micro details of the body, which as a ballet dancer, I enjoyed.
Was he a Musin protege or prodigy?
He was, and Musin had chosen him to take over the conservatoire. And the other masterclass, which sticks out as being pretty extraordinary, was the Dirigentenforum in Berlin runs this thing called the Critical Orchestra, das Kritische Orchester. It is the most mind-blowing thing. It's just a full orchestra made up of players from all of the orchestras all over Germany. They come and donate their time for free for a week, and they are the teachers. There's no conducting teacher in the room.
Oh, wow.
It's intense, and most of it's run in German, and my German at the time was pretty minimal. But there were these hilarious things. The bassoonist at some point stood up and was just kind of screaming at me. And I must have looked like I was about to pee my pants or something, because the concertmaster that day stood up and he said, "It's okay. he's paying you a compliment. But it was just this extremely aggressive German rah, from the back row of the winds. But that was cool. That was really amazing. A lot of old, retired Bayreuth players coming out of the woodwork, coming out of retirement to play for it, and they would teach you how to do the Wagner. And there was one player, I can't remember his name, who was Russian. He'd been playing in Berlin for years, but was originally from Russia. So he led the Shostakovich session and things like that. So you were learning from the players. And it was that interesting thing that sometimes they didn't know a technical way of telling you what wasn't working, but what they did say was so much more insightful because it was all about breath and preparation and how it related to what they needed instead of how it looked. So that was a brilliant masterclass. Terrifying, absolutely terrifying, but great.
So as well as many, many masterclasses, I read that you've been assistant to quite a few conductors as well, with various orchestras: Christoph von Dohnanyi, Esa-Pekka Salonen, Marin Alsop, Donald Runnicles, Peter Ungian, and Thomas Sondergaard. That's quite a list. That's quite a who's who of conductors. How did they use you as an assistant conductor, or advise you, or teach you, or anything that you can tell us about what it was like being assistant to all of those people?
It was really different for each of them. Sometimes it was something they hadn't set up, so they were quite disinterested. The one with Dohnanyi was interesting kind of contextually. It was just a single gig, and it was when I was the librarian at the Philharmonia, which was my first job when I got here, full-time librarian. And they all knew that I conducted, and I was doing various bits and bobs with some of the players and helping out with things, and often doing offstage conducting and things like that. But anyway, this was for a concert at either Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle, one of the royal gigs that the Philharmonia does. And it was a whole lot of Wagner excerpts, and they needed someone to conduct the offstage horn from behind this strange little closet in between the staff kitchen and the throne room, or something crazy like this. And of course, there's no, you can't start putting in cameras and screens and things. We just had to sort of peer through a hole in this however 100-year-old wall and hope that we were hearing without too much delay, and do it from that. But he's a lovely man. He's very generous. For Esa-Pekka, it was, again, very specific. It was one occasion when he was recording a part of his violin concerto for an ad on TV, and he had to leave halfway through the session to go and catch a flight. So whenever you can't specifically see him or his hands in the video, it's me conducting, which is pretty cool. And that was funny. It was hilarious. It was a massive American company doing it. So there was smoke machines, and, you know, they wanted the violinists to sit in a, what looked beautiful visually, but bore no relationship to what an orchestra would do. So we had an amazing day. It was really funny, very surreal. And of course, I'd been their librarian for 2 years, and most of them had never seen me conducting. We were just mates. And I'd never conducted an orchestra that wonderful. It was, I should have been far more nervous than I was. But anyway, I put the first downbeat down, and of course they played half an hour after I was expecting them to. And they just saw this sort of little look of surprise on my face, and they all just burst out laughing, and in a very kind, loving, 40 of my best friends kind of way, because they knew exactly that moment in your career where you felt that for the first time. That's really cool. It was with us. It was this lovely, lovely atmosphere. With the longer assistantships, Runnicles came about through the fellowship at the RCS that I had. And my main teacher for that was Gary Walker, who is a Scottish conductor. Again, a phenomenal teacher. I absolutely loved learning from him. He was very, very generous with his time. He's much busier now. I think he finds it harder to juggle, but he's the kind of teacher or the kind of conductor that, he can hear a dog fart 10 blocks away and tell you what pitch it was. So he's an amazing teacher. And then we would go down, the other fellow and I, and we would assist Runnacles whenever he was in town. And he used us a lot for listening to things and running notes around the orchestra and that sort of thing, but we never got to do any conducting. And it was great to watch him rehearsing. I mean, I saw him put Wozzeck together in a day and a half or something insane like that.
Wow.
And yeah, it was really impressive. Peter Ungen and Thomas Zondergaard, that came about through, I was the full-time assistant at the RSNO for 2 years, which is one of the few, I mean, CBSO has a similar position, LSO, the RSNO, and sometimes the Halle have an assistant. But there are very few positions like that. So lucky to get it. Peter was a lovely person to work with. He was very generous and caring, and he knew the unique personality of that orchestra as well as I did. So we would talk quite openly about how it felt to be in those situations in rehearsal. And their new chief conductor now, Thomas Zondergaard, is equally loving, generous, very genuine man, and was a real joy to assist. And my goodness, you learn so much from him. Each rehearsal was like a hardcore musicianship class, but everything, both of those men, well, they were very, very different. I learned different things from Peter. He was just like a dad. He was so kind and generous, and always we would go for a meal when he and his wife were in town. They even came round to our little flat one night for a cup of tea, and of course, to them it would have been so humble, but they were just so kind and generous-spirited, lovely, lovely people to get to know.
So, as you said, your first job when you came to the UK was librarian at the Philharmonia, but I have also noticed your name in the end credits after concerts on the Berlin Philharmonic Digital Concert Hall. Can you tell us something about that?
Yes. So I did the librarian job for 2 years, and being an Antipodean, I had access to a particular visa that gave me 2 years of not needing to be sponsored by an employer. So I did it on that, and then I was coming to the end of that. I had grey hair, I'd had a run-in with cancer, it just ravaged my body doing that job for the Philharmonia. I loved it. It was 2 of the happiest years of my life, but it's exhausting. And I thought, well, do I really want to give up on conducting completely? Because you can't do both with a job like that. And am I committing my life to being a librarian? I thought, no, it doesn't feel like this is what I want to do for life. But in giving it away, I had to leave the UK because I didn't have sponsorship. So I moved to Berlin, was unemployed, as one can be in Berlin and survive. And a friend, well, actually, John Carew's daughter was playing did again in the forum workshop that I talked about, and she made contact and hit me up having lessons with John Carew, but also her husband is the big boss at the Berlin Phil Digital Concert Hall, and she said, look, they always need people who can read a score. So I used to go in on the weekends and do the score reading for the film directors. And for the really long nights, like a Mahler symphony with loads of cues, visual cues that the camera director wanted to cut between, there'd be hundreds of cues that you're calling in German. And by the end of it, I would just be inventing numbers because my brain would be so addled. But it was so fun. It was a really nice job. And I did a lot of those sorts of things for the Philharmonia when I was there too.
Can you tell us how your career started to take off? What were those early first guest conducting engagements?
Well, it started off before I left New Zealand. I'd done a lot of opera, and well, I say a lot of opera in a graduate student, amateur, small town kind of way. That had been my main work, and so the first thing I did was got some work assisting at Opera Holland Park. Bless them. They let me be chorus mistress for a year for a couple of the shows, and I did a bit of assisting. And the following year, they gave me the associate conductor on the Young Artist program, the Christine Collins program as it was then. And through that, I mean, all of those little summer opera festival things around the UK, once you've done one of them and not killed the show, then often the other summer festivals will pick you up for a bit of assisting as well. So I ended up going to Garsington, doing the same thing, and from that got spoke at Opera North doing the same thing, and Loughborough. So I made my way around those mid-size opera houses and summer opera houses doing assisting. And then I ended up getting the RCS fellowship, which I know we're talking about work, and that's more of a study thing, but it was sort of half and half. You become like a staff conductor at the conservatoire. And yes, you get lessons and training, and you work with the Red Note Ensemble, and you still get lessons from Gary, but you also do a lot of actual conducting work, and you get hired elsewhere. So from that, I ended up at the RSNO assistant job. From those connections, well, actually, before the RSNO job, I got the resident conductor at the National Youth Orchestra of Scotland, which was amazing, absolutely amazing. Some of the hardest work I've ever done, because I had the youngest age group, and when you've got an orchestra, you know those youth orchestras, they're massive, they're absolute behemoths, and we had everything from 8 years old up to about 16 in the one orchestra, often sitting right next to each other.
You've also founded, with your husband, the Niels Ensemble. How did that come about?
Nevis started more recently. So I finished at RSNO and then started doing the sort of the BBC orchestras and Scottish Ballet and various bits of that kind of conducting around the country. But Nevis actually, we didn't found it. We were hired by Jamie Munn, who runs it. It's his brainchild. And he had been asking around Scotland to see which conductors people recommended, and these two names came up repeatedly. He didn't realise until further along the process that we're husband and wife. So it actually worked out very nicely, and the three of us, plus the other sort of staff and senior players, we make a good team. It's one of the weirdest projects I've ever done, but probably one of the pieces of work I do that I enjoy the most. And it works on the premise that music is for everyone, everywhere. There's plenty of music going on in concert halls, so we just don't go to them. Instead, we will go to supermarkets in some of the lower socioeconomic areas in Glasgow, or we'll go to the top of a mountain, or go out to the remote Hebridean Islands, or turn up in prisons. So we do, people call it outreach, but for us, that's just all we do, basically. That's our main work.
That sounds wonderful.
It's very cool. It's very, very cool. And Scotland is the right place to be doing it, politically and philosophically. It's fertile soil for people wanting that and respecting it and liking it, liking to support it and wanting to see it in more communities. So we get a lot of support from the public, a lot of support from foundations and the Scottish Parliament, which is brilliant to know that what you're doing is valued by people other than yourselves, which is often a difficult thing in the performing arts.
So outside of Scotland, where else did your guest conducting take you at this time?
So coming out of the RSNO assistantship, it led into lots of work with the BBC orchestras and Ulster and LPO and LSO, mainly education and outreach work to start off with, as most conductors of my generation do. And actually, I think a lot of conductors overall do now. It's a huge part of our work and incredibly challenging. This is so much harder than people think.
I said this the other day. Don't you think that those type of concerts are some of, if not the hardest concerts you ever get to conduct?
Absolutely.
Nothing like as easy as an overture, a concerto, and a symphony.
I know. And also you're doing it on a tiny amount of rehearsal. So the first thing I did with the LSO in their full setup was Rite of Spring on an hour and 20 minutes of rehearsal. It's just like, I mean, this couldn't be madder, but you realize actually it forces you to trust players, one thing, which is a good thing to learn. And it forces you to learn to be economical with your rehearsal. But then I did find that when I started getting proper grown-up gigs with BBC Phil and that sort of thing, I could see these, 2.5 days of rehearsal. What on earth am I going to do with that? So I had to really, I found that nerve-wracking, having too much rehearsal time, more than I was used to. And of course, you always fill it up, but at the time, you sort of think, oh gosh, give me 20 minutes and I know how to, slap something together, but this is terrifying to be able to think of something interesting and insightful to say for 2.5 days. I don't know if I have it in me. But of course, you start working and it's fine, it works out. The other conducting that I've done quite a bit of in these years has been ballet, which is funny coming full circle from having studied ballet to now be in the pits. And I really enjoy it. I don't quite understand why it's often looked down upon as out of the various forms of conducting and often the worst paid, because it's so specialized, I suppose, but it's so pleasurable. I would argue the worst ballet scores are far better than the worst opera scores. And I quite like the challenge that it's not about your own ego. It's not about your own interpretation of the piece. It's, okay, tonight I have this couple dancing. She has very long legs. He has quite a short torso. He does spins this fast, and he always likes the last 0.8 of a second of it to slow down slightly. And, you learn their bodies so intimately, and sometimes you have to do that very, very quickly. And so each night it's like, skiing a slalom race where you have the poles down the mountain and you have to sort of plot a course around them and they change each time. Each night with the ballet is like that. It's a slightly different set of markers to make a beautiful thing around, make a beautiful course around somehow.
Wonderful answer. Super.
Well, it's the only sort of metaphor I can think to explain it, because it's so different to opera in that way, in terms of pit conducting. But I get a huge amount of pleasure out of it. Of course, because I'm intimate with ballet itself, there's that driver. But I think it's unfairly maligned as an outlet of conducting work. I think it's really pleasurable to do, and you can't get by with no technique, because in an opera pit, the orchestra can hear the singers. So yes, they're watching, but a lot of their work is listening and accompanying by ear. Ballet, you don't have that at all. They have no clue what's happening. It's entirely down to the conductor to keep it together. So it's a good test, actually. I think conducting students should be encouraged to do more of it.
So in January 2020, Symphony Nova Scotia announced you as their music director designate. When does that mean you start?
Well, all things going well, it will be starting in October. I know you didn't want to talk about COVID-19, but of course that puts a big question mark over when people's 2021 seasons will be starting and in what form. But technically, I start in October of this year.
Great. And so are you already devising, or have you already devised your first season?
The first season they already had planned, because the appointment process they were very rigorous. It was 2 years of trials and things. It started off, there were about 12 of us on trial, or 10 of us. And then this season just been, there were 2 of us on trial. So it's been going on a long time. And by the time that was all announced, they had to have already had their planning in place for this coming season for the Canadian government's funding scheme. So this coming season, I've not really had any input into. A little bit, the odd family concert or something like that I've contributed to, but the main repertoire, the soloists were already in place. So it'll be the following season that we get to build together. They're a really lovely orchestra. It's Scottish chamber orchestra size, and most of the repertoire they do is that size. They augment sometimes, but they definitely don't do massive triple wind stuff. It's a smallish city, but it's quite affluent, very liberal, left-wing, a high percentage of tertiary educated people and professionals, and a really interesting Indigenous history along that coastline in that part of the country. So there's loads of interesting stuff there. Lovely, lovely people in the orchestra. It felt immediately like walking into a room with 40 mates from university that I hadn't seen in 20 years. And we just sort of, you sort of finish rehearsal and someone would just say, "Oh, I'm having a barbecue at my place. Do you want to come?" It was just so informal and relaxed and friendly. No politics, no egos in the room. It was so, so brilliant. So we got on immediately, and they're really lovely to make music with as well. They're really up for trying different things, and to the point that they will try things and look up to see whether I liked it or not. And if I give them a smile and a wink, we'll go with that. And it's real banter in the room, if you know what I mean. It's really nice.
Oh, it's wonderful when you have an orchestra that want to do that with you.
I know, I feel insanely lucky.
How do you go about learning a score? With your piano playing background, do you learn it at the piano or do you sit at a desk? And when you learn a score, do you make many markings, or are you one of these lucky people who store it all in their brain?
I definitely don't store a great deal of it in my brain, at least not to begin with. So I do it at the desk or the table or on the plane or on the train rather than at the piano. And that's just because I fell out of the habit of it. Moving country so many times, I didn't have access to a keyboard for about 10, 12 years. So I've just sort of never gotten back into doing it now that I'm used to not doing it. So I liked sitting at a table or a desk or curled up on the couch and doing it. I quite like doing it somewhere quite noisy, like a cafe or a train station or something like that. A little bit of background noise helps for me. If it's complete silence, I get distracted and find myself on Twitter or something like that. But if there's a bit of noise and a few people knocking around, I can settle more for some reason. And I start, if I have the luxury of plenty of time, then I start with learning the biggest structures about the piece. So if it's within the bounds of tonality, where does it begin and end? And then make my way into, well, then over the 4 movements, if it's a symphony, what's the harmonic progression of those in relation to each other? And then once I'm clear of that large structure, then I'll start looking movement by movement. Well, where's the development? How far does that go from the tonic, and how does it make its way back in very big brush strokes? And I get reduced and reduced and reduced until it's at the point with, if it needs it, if it's the kind of piece that it's useful to know this bar by bar, I can be tracing what's happening harmonically. Now, if I look at, say, Mozart or Haydn or Beethoven expositions and recapitulations, the developments are different. You don't need to be, I don't find I need to be that specific anymore, because you can see within 8 or 16 bar phrases what's happening harmonically. There's far less to be tracing very carefully. It's simpler in that regard. And from that, you get an idea of the form, and then it's very basic. I get a pencil and a ruler, just a normal black pencil, and mark large phrases with a vertical slash so that I can at a glance see, okay, there are 3 4-bar phrases and then a 6-bar phrase at the end, and then I've got a double line down to show, okay, this is the beginning of a significant new section. So I sort of do structural things like that. Depending on the layout of the score, I might pencil in cues for myself that I need to remind myself, or if it's not clear from the layout that that's actually trumpets not horns. You know, so every now and then you find a score that the horns and trumpets are the other way around, or if there's something like in the exposition, this was a cor anglais solo, but when it comes back in the recapitulation, actually the violas are playing along at the same time, then I'll mark that the violas have joined them. So I'll have a little connecting line between the two to remind myself that there's a colour change this time. And the other thing I was just thinking is if you have divisi strings and it's not clear whether that's the second half of the firsts or actually a second violin part, or you know, things like that, I would mark in there. Things like a forte piano or something like that that requires a really decisive, or a subito forte or a subito piano that requires very much a decisive or active gesture to force it to happen, then I would probably mark that in until I have it ingrained in my head that it's there, and then I might rub it out. But the only change I would say to that is if it's a lot of the kind of education and outreach engagement sort of concerts, often you only get the scores a week before, 5 days before. Some of them I've turned up on the morning and there's a score on the desk and I'm rehearsing at 10 a.m. So in those cases, I'll be far more everything written in, every time change written in, because I'm essentially, you just have to sight read or learn it overnight.
That's very true. Often you get to do schools and family concerts and the scores arrive very late. Or the other one, film music concerts, when the hire companies don't send them until the last minute. And you're left with 2 days to learn a 7-minute piece of film music. That's when the pencils come out in strength.
Absolutely. And I have no shame about it. You know, that's just life. And you do, as with everything we do, you do what you need to do to get the show on the stage and to be helpful to the players. And if that means drawing like a toddler on your score, crotch at 80 over the page, you know, then do that. If that's going to help the players do what they need to do, then do that.
So, Holly, every conductor is being asked the same 10 questions at the end of the podcast, and you are no different. So, shall we start with what sound or noise do you love and what sound or noise do you hate?
I love sounds associated with nature. So, in particular, I love the sound of waves on a shoreline, partly because I grew up on the coast. But just that feeling of that sound rather of total silence, but just the gentle rolling of waves. And if I'm ever in a really noisy, horrible hotel, I have an app that I can listen to as I sleep with waves crashing on a shore, and that helps me sleep. In terms of a sound I hate, at the moment, it would be the sound of American politics. And I mean that quite specifically, and that, you know, we're all looking at social media and things, and quite often we'll be in bed before we go to sleep and flicking through Twitter, and a video will pop up and the sound will come on of a certain American politician delivering some cringy press conference or something, and my entire body reacts really extremely to it. It's the most abhorrent sound at the moment to me.
If you had 24 hours free, what would you spend it doing?
If I was at home and I didn't have loads of housework to do, I would do something with craft, like some pottery or painting. I really enjoy doing things like that. Or if the weather was dreadful, I would probably play on my Xbox. I do love a bit of Xbox. If I had slightly longer than 24 hours, I would try and climb up a mountain, get into the hills somewhere.
Who would be a favourite conductor of yesteryear?
For me, there's definitely just one for this. I can reduce it to one, and that's Carlos Kleiber. I'm guessing he'll be on a lot of people's lists. But he's, I don't know, he conducts with such generosity and spontaneity. And watching footage of him, you get the sense that the tempo really served the sense of line and was driven by harmony. It was never a regulated click in his head. It was always alive and singing, and yeah, Kleiber for sure.
And who would be a favourite current conductor?
Well, this I have to do in categories, I think, and I definitely can't get it down to one. If I was going to say the conductors that interest me the most, I would say the weird ones who kind of are very niche in their interests and what they do. Someone like Philippe Hedderweger, you know, he's got a smallish pool of repertoire, and it doesn't necessarily go particularly well when he tries to be a generalist. But within his specialism, you can get something utterly unique and deeply thought out. He chooses what he's going to show you, which is usually quite an interesting thing to show you, and he goes very deep into it, and I really enjoy that. So I like people like that who do quite niche, particular things. In terms of rehearsal, I'm going to separate the other favourites into rehearsal and technique. In terms of rehearsal conductors, I personally think you can't go beyond Ivan Fischer, Daniele Gatti, and I love Susanna Malky in rehearsal as well. She's a phenomenal conductor in rehearsal. But all of them, they'll take something and in a very short amount of time completely reorder the way your ears hear it. In very different ways, three totally different personalities. But they're three people who, when you watch in rehearsal, your mind explodes. In terms of beautiful technique, I would say at the moment my two favourites would be Paavo Järvi, I think has gorgeous technique. There's a lovely video of him on YouTube conducting Sibelius Valse Triste. And it is just the most sumptuous, sweet, kind of invitational style of conducting. You know, he just invites the orchestra to play. He gives a suggestion and lets them respond. It's so nice. And the other person I love is Tugan Sokiev. If I could die with a technique half as good as Tugan Sokiev's, I would be a very, very happy woman.
What is the hardest work you have ever conducted?
Quite possibly Sibelius Lemminkainen Suite, with the exception of the Swan of Tuonela, which is not so hard to conduct, but the outer movements, the kind of moderating these long expanses of an engine running somewhere in the strings with the verticals coming from elsewhere, or an engine that has to be quite vertical and regular in the way it works actually in the strings, but then you get these long soaring kind of horizon-like melodies in the wind and brass, and trying to make all of that work with rather bizarre tempo indications or confusing tempo indications. It's not entirely sure what he wants sometimes. I found that incredibly hard. The other really rock hard piece that springs to mind is Jörg Widmann's Con Brio. I don't know if you've done that.
Oh God, I've done that piece. Oh, you can't rehearse it for longer than about 4 bars at a time.
No, it's unbelievable. It is one of the hardest things. I think it is worth rehearsing because the piece that comes out at the end is really superb actually, but man alive, that was hard. Like every bar and a half, there's a completely different tempo change. There might be a specific tempo for 2 crotchets of a bar, and then it's 3 times as fast the rest of the bar. Absolute rock hard music, but worthwhile doing. The worst is when you have something that's difficult to rehearse like that, and the result at the end of it really doesn't kind of warrant the amount of effort put in. But that piece, I think it does actually.
I have to agree. I think that's a wonderful piece of music. It's just incredibly hard to put together. When travelling abroad to conduct, what item could you not leave home without?
Earl Grey tea.
Simple answer.
Very simple answer.
What is the one thing you would change about being a conductor?
Oh, actually, am I allowed to say 2 things?
Of course you are.
First one is not going to be popular. I think we get paid too much. Well, probably not at my end of the career, but the big conductors, they get paid far too much. I don't think any industry that there is any justification for the person at the top being paid that much more than the people on the lowest pay. I think it's obscene. and I think it's contributed to a culture in which abuses of power can happen. And we're really just a member of the percussion section. And the sooner we get back to thinking of ourselves that way, that a lot of things will get better for a lot of people. So I think we get paid too much. I think also we, and this is not so much something that I want to change because I love it in many ways, but I think we will have to move away from our reliance on touring and travel. Partly, again, the finances of it. It's ridiculous how much money is spent on flying conductors around, often in first class and with first class accommodation and things, at a time when we should be doing far less of it in terms of the environment. And it's sort of, I don't know, it's sort of feels like a hangover from the big, crazy, padded shoulder 1980s, if you know what I mean. It's a sort of a self-indulgent aspect of what we do that I don't think is healthy anymore.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
Ooh, I think if I wasn't conducting and finances allowed, I would want to be a potter or a furniture maker or something like that, something really practical with my hands, making a physical object that is useful to people. That would be the ideal foil to being a musician. Complete opposite.
If the world were to end tonight, what would be your choice of final meal and drink?
Cheesy mashed potatoes, fresh peas, a thick lamb or chicken stew, and a glass of Quartz Reef Pinot Noir from New Zealand.
Superb answer. Thank you very much, Holly. What a fascinating talk with you today, and I hope we can see each other very soon.
You too. Thanks. Thanks very much. It's been really enjoyable.
A Mic on the Podium was devised and produced by Michael Seal, with music by Ben Dawson. Next time, I talk to a Dutch conductor who has also conducted opera and ballet, as well as in the concert hall. He is also a highly regarded teacher of conducting and one of the most charming conductors you could ever wish to meet. Until then, bye bye!